Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Terry Martin.
Hello and welcome. I'm Terry Martin. She's already said that. If you're interested in surveillance ethics, you've come to the right place. That's what we're going to be talking about for the next 50 minutes. And I've got a bunch of questions for our three amazing panelists, but I would love to get some input from you guys too. I'm sure you have questions too, or you wouldn't be sitting here. Try to think about them. I'll be trying to bring in input from the floor as we go along. I also want to say just one little further detail of housekeeping before we continue, and that is there's a Slido questionnaire that goes with this session. It's just one multiple choice question, very straightforward, should be easy to answer. I'd really appreciate it if you could give us your input on that particular question there. You'll find it in your app. It should just pop up if you go to this session on your app for the program where you're finding the agenda, etc. Yeah, and then when we get to the end of the session, we can take a look and see where things stand on that. So without further ado, I'll give a quick topical introduction and introduce our guests. So surveillance ethics, it's become a massive topic in the digital age, and for obvious reasons. Technology has made surveillance easy, quick and inexpensive, and it's being rolled out on a massive scale by governments, good and bad, by companies, and by criminal organizations as well that are using this technology. We're going to be talking about all of that today. And of course, surveillance affects everyone who uses the internet or digital communications technologies. Yeah, it touches us in many different ways, and we're going to try to explore some of that today and to find out what may hurt us and what may be useful. Now, I don't want to make surveillance out to be a bad thing, right? Surveillance can be a very good thing. It can help keep our societies safe. We use it to prevent accidents, to prevent crimes, and possibly even terrorist attacks, right? So surveillance, when used properly, can be really helpful for society. So I'm not demonizing surveillance here in any way. But the question that comes up is, what constitutes ethical and unethical surveillance? When is it good and when is it bad? And how do you make that distinction? We're going to jump straight in at the beginning to try to figure that out and provide a basis for the discussion as we move forward. And we are going to explore this tension between privacy and security. Privacy, on the one hand, we want to protect that. Security, we want to live in secure societies that are not going to be susceptible to terrorist attacks, for example. All right, so without further ado, I'll introduce our three amazing panelists. We have with us, first of all, Thomas Tschersich. He's Chief Security Officer of the telecommunications giant Deutsche Telekom, which operates globally. Also, Meredith Whittaker, formerly of Google. She is now the president of the Signal Foundation, which develops the Signal Messenger app and the Signal protocol. It's used for communications. She was formerly at Google, has a lot of experience both in the private sector and nonprofit and the academic world. And also with us is Andres Ilves from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. He is responsible for the Caucasus and the Near East region there. A warm round of applause for our three panelists. Like I say, I've got a bunch of questions, so I'm going to start up here on the stage, but we have people with microphones who will come around to you either during the session or towards the end and get some input from you. I'm glad to see even more people coming. Wonderful. We do have some seats free. So let's start. I'm going to start with you, Meredith. Help us out here, laying the basis for this. Like I said, we want to try to figure out what sort of terms we're talking about here. Again, you have all this experience, also having dealt with surveillance from an academic point of view in the digital space. So tell us, how do you distinguish between legitimate monitoring of human activity and unethical surveillance? What's the difference?
Thank you for that question. Is this on? It is on. I think, well, first I would say that's not a technological question. That's
No.
a political and social question.
Sure.
And it has everything to do with the power relationships, with the relationship between those who are doing the surveilling and those who are being surveilled. So it's a question that constitutively requires context, it requires a political landscaping, and it requires an understanding of the potential consequences of that surveillance. Now, of course, we are in a world that over the past 20, 30 years has changed the definition of what surveillance can be from laborious wiretaps or, looking at someone's mail, kind of seeing scraps of information about them that are not comprehensive or granular, to, of course, this digital world where our relationships, our most personal thoughts, our intimate messages, our locations, our purchases, our desires are being logged and cataloged and sold and resold and interpreted and reinterpreted by different statistical models, creating data profiles, right or wrong, that are incredibly comprehensive and that are available to many, many actors that we will likely never know or enumerate. So the stakes of that surveillance have gotten much, much, much higher. The potential consequences have become higher, but the ultimate question of what is and is not ethical remains social and political, not technological.
Okay, I'm going to ask a follow-up question to you before I bring in our other two panelists. That's a very carefully worded description and contextualized observations, very, very useful and important and true, I would guess. But I want to bring it down now to something really common that everybody in this room can relate to, and it's the question of cookies. Right? Every time we
reject all.
Well, there you go. That's just it. Every time that we go to a website, or if you've been noticing this on your phones here, every time you have to log back into the internet, you have to accept all cookies, reject all cookies. We're confronted with these questions, manage preferences, and if you do that, and I do this sometimes, go to manage preferences. And wow, you're confronted with 50 different questions. And okay, these 30 vendors have legitimate interest in, and what are they going to do with that data? How do you deal with that? Making a decision is very difficult. Do you give your consent or not give your consent? Can it be? We know it's annoying. Can it be dangerous?
Sorry, can what be dangerous?
Can the cookies that we accept, that we allow to follow us, maybe track us across different apps, can they be dangerous?
Of course. So
Maybe
if they're tracking us, let's take the United
tell us
States
how.
as an example, where in many states access to healthcare is being restricted for women. Now, if my cookies are showing that I'm bouncing between websites that are instructing me on how to access prohibited healthcare, and if those cookies are communicating that to people or institutions that may punish me for such access to information, then of course they can be dangerous, right? And that's one example. I could extrapolate into many, many hypotheticals. But again, what is that predicated on? That's not a technological issue. That's an issue of, where the rule of law has gone, what is and is not criminalized, and what the actors with access to that information may or may not wish to do to me based on that information. So we cannot maintain this conversation at the level of sort of technological generalities. We need to recognize that this is political, and in the context of more authoritarian regimes, in the context where access to resources and freedoms are being criminalized, we need to recognize that constitutively we have to have the ability to communicate, the ability to explore, the ability to access information in a way that is not surveilled. And this is really the crux of this conversation, in my view.
I think we could have a whole session on just that topic, but we do need to move on. I hope we can come back to it because it really is something that I suspect everyone in this room has to deal with. And you're confronted with this question: accept cookies, don't accept cookies, and you're trying to get some information, and we're subjecting ourselves to a potential danger there. Thomas Tschersich, as Chief Security Officer at Deutsche Telekom, you are responsible for the security of your company, protecting your company and its customers, right? Tell us how surveillance technologies play a role for you. Do they play a role?
First, a comment on the cookies, right? It's like in the real world. If we consume too much, it's bad for our body, and
but everybody likes cookies.
And it's actually kind of the same in the digital world, I would say. So, in my professional career, I'm not only responsible, as you rightfully mentioned, to protect the company itself, but also to our customers. So we're a digitization company, and the growth is coming out of the trust of the customers. If customers can trust in that we handle their data with care, they will simply not consume our services. They will simply move to other operators, right? And therefore, it's in the middle of our attention to protect the privacy of our customers as much as we can. Of course, there's a lot of legal requirements on operators, so how to make data available, how to tap on data, and the like. But this is then more the political issue, and we should, as an operator, and we will, avoid to give more data than necessary, to give more data than legally required. And we're very strict on that, and I believe it's our duty to provide the right technology for our customers to preserve their privacy and to help them protect their data, their information, their behavior. Because if everybody is fearing that he's tapped in everything what he's doing, it will change our behavior over time, and it will create harm to our society.
And what sort of, when you say, okay, you're protecting your customers and also your company against potentially criminal or nefarious forces out there, what are we talking about? What are the threats in concrete terms?
Look, starting with tapping communication. We worked heavily on integrating in the latest mobile standards like 5G, but also 4G, introducing and bringing mandatory encryption. So everything is encrypted end-to-end from the mobile device to the other mobile device. So it was in development over time. When we started with the first generations of mobile networks, there was no encryption at all. It was easy for everybody to tap those kind of communication. Nevertheless, it's a huge problem to get this standardized on a global level, because you need to interact with other networks, and there are certain different requirements on this planet available. Nevertheless, today it's easier than ever before for customers to use security technology like OTT technology, like Signal, like other email encryption technology to build it on top. But the problem, and as Meredith also said, is usually we're building technology from technicians for technicians, and not from technicians to real end users. So it's not that easy to handle, and that's our duty to become better on that.
That all makes perfect sense. I'm just going to, before I bring in our third speaker, just want to take a step back and try to, again, bring this down to the level of the user. I'm a Telekom customer. I live in Germany. I use your service. Used your services for a long time. What sort of potential threats am I subjecting myself to, or what sort of actors are you protecting me from?
So we're protecting you against actors like sending Trojans by SMS to your mobile phone. If you have an Android phone, you used to get those messages. There is a parcel to be delivered to you. Please click here.
And who might do that?
Once you click, then there is an app installed and trying to open up a back channel to criminals. So we do have a legal base to block these back channels once they're identified, and we're doing that. We're notifying our customers.
Can you tell us who is launching those sorts of attacks?
Who? This is mainly criminals from Eastern Europe, criminal organizations, out of companies with high level of education, but low income, mainly these days Russia, North Korea is financing themselves a lot due to those kind of attacks, so just gaining money back for financing the state activities. So that's the main focus on the private customers. China and others are more focused on these industrial espionage topics, I would say.
Thank you very much. That brings us very smoothly to our next speaker, Andres Ilves. Andres, I know before you joined Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, you were with the BBC, and you worked in really difficult environments. Now you're working also serving those areas where you were before, but also really difficult environments. Tell us about the surveillance cultures of the regions that you serve, that you're responsible for. Are your audiences there subjected to surveillance?
I'm really glad you asked that question. One thing, I'm sitting here and I'm looking at the word democratically elected government should do more too. And I think it's really important for us to remind ourselves, here we are sitting in a completely free environment where we can speak freely, where we're in a country that has a democratically elected government. And as you said, just to say, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty specifically, the only reason, the raison d'etre of RFERL is to provide media information that people are denied access to, either because the government is not democratically elected or because there's in some other way a restriction on access to information. So that's why we do what we do. Now, so there's a continuum, right? I mean, you have basically where we are here. I'm Estonian. Estonia is also very, media free and democratic. And then RFERL also operates, and I'm responsible specifically for Afghanistan. Now, there's also a continuum there, because we're talking about the internet, we're talking about electronic media and so on. I just want to say the Taliban have been in power for 3 years. In Kabul alone, they have put up 90,000 CCTV cameras. The other day, because I was bored, I calculated that's installing 3 cameras every hour. So there is a continuum also of how governments want to control information, access to information, and so on, and then the information they want to gather about their citizens. But then there's the other piece, which is really where, for us, the rubber hits the road. We don't sit in Prague and just go, well, this is what we think you should know today. Depending on the circumstances, we have people gathering news on the ground. And that is, of course, where it really gets difficult, because case in point, we haven't really talked about Pegasus and Predator. Those are just incredible technologies. And we in Armenia, which is one of the countries that I would say broadcast, but it's, we live in a modern era where it's also TV and digital.
Those being spy programs, basically.
There being spy programs. And it's not even clear how they got into these people's phones. I mean, I'm given to understand they don't actually, there are ways you can call somebody up and then they pick, the answer, and then we know. But apparently you can actually infect somebody's phone with Pegasus without actually getting anywhere near the phone or contact with them. So there you go. I'm not suggesting it's the Armenian government that did it either. They have some countries nearby that are not their friends.
So the governments where your audiences are living,
yes,
they themselves are using this kind of spy software against their own citizenry.
Yes, or in this case, probably a nearby country was using it against Armenian citizens. So, first of all, we have to live this every day. We have journalists who are courageous because they're even sticking their head above, the parapet and sort of reporting on stuff in incredibly repressive environments. So people have to deal with restricted access. I'm also responsible for Iran. Not a great media access country either. But the subtext in all of this also is they don't want you to see the things that they don't want you to see. But then they also want to go after the people who are trying to provide the information. So our whole purpose is, if this is restricted, this human rights activist was jailed, this person was executed, we go out there and try to find out why, what's going on, and publicize what the governments want to hide. But because of that, they go and try to get into our phones. They go and try to follow where our people are going. And that, of course, is, I just want to underscore that a lot of the problems we're discussing here, they're really kind of rubber hits the road questions for democratic societies. But there are other countries where it is really insidious and there really is such a level of control. It's shocking.
True. Yeah. In my introduction, I'd meant to talk about security cameras and how they become so pervasive in some countries. Also democratic countries, I must say, not just in repressive regimes. By the way, if you guys want to jump in and have any questions of your fellow panelists, feel free. I have lots of questions, but I'd love to hear from you.
Maybe one thing to add here to what Andres said. We often make it easier for nation states, but also for criminal and crime actors to get access to our devices. As still the majority of the problem is coming out of known vulnerabilities. Known vulnerabilities, which makes it easy to bring in software which is unintended to mobile phones, to laptop computers, and it's easy to fix them because they're known. And also the patches are known, yeah? But I would say, and I will argue, if you rate all the press articles on successful crime actors in digital, 95% of them have the root cause of missing software updates.
Interesting. Meredith, you wanted to say something?
Does everyone know what Pegasus is? Yeah. And know that Pegasus is the product of a
some people
for-profit.
don't know what it is. I'm seeing some people shake, so maybe you can give us a
I
capsule
just think
summary
it's
of what-
important if we're anchoring this conversation on Pegasus. Pegasus is a product that's sold by a company called NSO. NSO sells targeted spyware. And so instead of being able to surveil, say, somebody's iMessages, because Apple's not going to do that, you exploit a vulnerability in the Apple operating system. You pressure Apple perhaps not to fix that vulnerability, and you use that exploit to install malware on a person's phone that is then able to effectively take over control of their phone with on the same terms that they have. So you can look at your Spotify playlist, you can read your Gmail, you can look at your iMessages, you can go back 20 years in some docs archive and find something you wrote, et cetera, et cetera.
You can activate the microphone or the microphone.
Yeah, we could
You can
spend all
listen.
day enumerating. Anything you do on your phone, you could do via Pegasus, via this malware.
And it's been used against some very
But
high-level leaders.
The key issue that I wanted to, this is not a naturally occurring vulnerability. This is a business. This is being sold to governments. This is being sold to individuals, some of them authoritarian. And this is a business that there are many people pushing to shut down. So there is a movement. I would look at Citizen Lab in Canada, who's done a lot of work against targeted spyware. And this is not simply an anti-surveillance stance. This is also an anti-insecurity and vulnerability stance, because this business is not possible without maintaining vulnerabilities in these core infrastructures. So Pegasus relies on an exploit of a vulnerability that needs to stay open for Pegasus to work, which makes all of us much more vulnerable. And this gets to a really key point here. Do you mind putting the poll back up on the screen so we can follow along? Because I want to nuance something here. So we have restrict corporate exploitation of personal data, and that seems to be a very popular answer. There's an issue here. If corporations can restrict it, other people can, right? There is an all or nothing dynamic when it comes to digital security here. If there's a backdoor for one person, if there's a vulnerability that Pegasus can exploit, hackers, hostile nation states, and others can also support that. So there is no backdoor in a network for a global communications system that only works for the good guys. And I think this room is a place I really want to say that, because Signal has to be out there fighting magical thinking that assumes that the good guys can get access while preventing the bad guys from getting access. And we need the people in this room who recognize how imperative the ability to communicate privately is, also fighting these issues. Because if you break a network at one point, you've broken it for everyone. You've broken it for Ukraine. You've broken it for Armenia. You've broken it for everyone. And I think I can't emphasize that point highly enough, and I think we need to spend some time there.
Signal, I just want to say one thing. I mean, if the people in this room are not familiar with Signal, Messenger is the communications.
Who is not familiar with Signal in this room?
I don't know. Well, yeah, I know some people use it, some don't, some may. Anyway.
Well, you have a treat in store because Signal is the coolest tech organization in the world, and it is the world's most widely used truly private messaging app. So we've developed the gold standard in encryption. We have encrypted across the stack, so not just the contents of the messages you send and the calls you make, so what you say, but we encrypt metadata at every level, which means that, yes, some security services cannot get that information, but it also means human rights workers, dissidents, journalists in Armenia, others are actually able to communicate and express their freedom in the digital world. You are welcome.
No, this is, I appreciate the plug for Signal. I do know that at least one person in this room who likes to use Signal. Anyway, we're talking about protecting personal privacy, right? Protecting ourselves. But I want to talk for a little bit about why governments use surveillance legitimately too, right? That surveillance is important in order to stop people from doing bad things as well, right? Surveillance can be employed in order to prevent a terrorist attack. In Germany, we just had a terrorist attack. It's ignited a huge debate about whether surveillance should be stepped up, if there should be more surveillance, if Germany has where I live, has very strict data regulations, privacy regulations concerning that. When now there's a new debate popping up. It's not a new debate, actually. It's an old debate about whether there should be restrictions, or fewer restrictions, in order for the government to maybe prevent something like that. Now, I'm not going to get into whether that's a good idea, bad idea, whatever, but I just want to point out that used properly, it could be good, I suppose. And I'm just wondering, Meredith, before bringing the other speakers again, about this Signal messaging app that you have. Could it also be used by the bad guys to prevent their communications being accessed by governments? Say, maybe people would be planning a terrorist attack right here in Prague. And could they be using your app to stop legitimate surveillance by governments from finding out about what they're doing?
I don't think you need me to answer that question, right? Could a road be used by a car filled with bad guys? Could the power company power the safe house of the bad guys?
So
I don't like.
Are there any ethical concerns or qualms that you have about that as president of the foundation?
I recognize where you're leading me. I've had a lot of media training, sir.
It's a legitimate question. I'm sorry.
Right. Let's flip it a little bit, right? Because a lot of things. The bad guys live in this world. No. They avail themselves of resources, infrastructures, affordances that we all do. They are human beings. They probably pick up the telephone. They do a lot of other things. So I am a law enforcement officer, and I have a pen, and I am certain that this pen has been used by bad guys to write out plans for their nefarious business. And I say, it is time to get them. I am going to the pen company, and I say, sir, how do you feel about bad guys having used this pen? I need you to instrument this pen with telemetry. I need you to make sure that it records everything that is written, and I need all pens to work this way because, as you know, the crux of the badness is in the communication of that badness.
Okay, listen,
right?
we only have so much time, and I appreciate your illustrations. I just want to point out we do have limited time, and I take it your answer is no. Yeah.
No, I'm not answering your question. I'm illustrating why I think the question is off base when we're talking about core freedoms and core infrastructures.
Right. Well, there's some who don't think that's off base. But anyway, I'm going to bring Thomas back in here on the question of what Deutsche Telekom does. I mean, does Deutsche Telekom, are you guys you have to keep tabs on your own customers too, right? Do you use cookies for that, or how do you do that?
No. So there's very clear defined democratic rules by the parliaments, in which cases we need to provide data, and also the way is precisely defined, and the technology as well. So there are two hearts in myself, right? So if talking about terrorist attacks, I tend to say it's a good thing to avoid those by surveillance technology. But at the other hand, it's a bad thing as it can be also misused for other purposes. So therefore, we need to have a consensus, in my view, which is in democracies driven by the parliaments. We need to have clear and strict rules, which needs to be followed, and which needs to be also independently observed and inspected to avoid any misuse and abuse on these kind of processes. Right? This is the nature of democracies,
Sure.
in my view.
Well,
And by the way, we often get also requests from law enforcement which are trying to get a bit on top or a bit more. And this is general no. There is no way. So there's a legal description what is possible. And other than that, go to the parliament, get a new law. Then we can do this based on our democratic rules. Otherwise, you won't get the data.
Andres, your broadcasts are probably blocked in some places. I name it. I take it in repressive regimes. How do the people you reach access your material in those environments, your content?
Well, it's an apt question. And of course, it's not just the broadcast, it's access via the internet. So Iran has 92 million people approximately. By the latest estimate, 32 million Iranians have VPNs installed on their phones.
Virtual private networks that allow you to
Exactly.
operate
And so
anonymously.
that's a really important thing for people to try to get around that. The sad thing, of course, is that in the types of places that we work, people simply take it as a given that they're not going to be able to see, read, hear what they have a right to see, read, hear. And so they're already used to trying to find ways to get around it. But it's very difficult. And of course, what's sad is that sometimes, often, we just report completely benign things, except that the government just doesn't want them to know this information or whatever. So people have this craving, especially the more that it's forbidden, then the more they want to know what's going on. And it's just a difficult thing for us, but it is, it's frankly why we do what we do. As long as somebody's saying, we're going to keep this in the dark, then our whole purpose is to shine light on it and say, well, okay, there's this, whatever your opinion is either way, but there is this additional information. And so people will try by whatever means. But as you said, virtual private networks are a key way for people.
Now, you all you work. I'm really glad that we have this panel, all three of you here today, because you come at things from a slightly different angle, right? You're working in different sectors to some degree. And everyone in this room, we talked about it already, is subjected to, well, let's call it surveillance, attacks, if you will, or people trying to use their data in ways that might not benefit them. What advice would you three offer our audience here from your perspective about what they can do and what maybe governments can do to help mitigate the risks of surveillance being used for nefarious purposes? Go right ahead.
I just want to say, and I say this everywhere, regardless of the regime, the country, or wherever I am, is know your rights. It's really important to know your rights, and rights under these circumstances vary from country to country. I want to bring up the example. There's a guy named David Miranda, and he was detained at Heathrow Airport for 9 hours. Does anybody know about this? This was in August of 2013. He was the husband of a Guardian journalist named Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald had been investigating the NSA and writing a series for The Guardian about it. He had a male partner, a Brazilian, who happened to be passing through Heathrow Airport in August of 2013. They detained him for, I think, just a few minutes under 9 hours, because that was the legal limit. And why did they detain him? He's the partner. He's not even a journalist. Because they demanded access to his passwords for his phone and his laptop. And so this guy, he didn't know what they had a right to get from him or not. And in the end, he buckled, and he gave them the information that they wanted. But they basically coerced this person. And so this is a side part of this question of surveillance and so on, is they weren't, if you will, surveilling him. They scared the guy into giving up this information for their own purposes, legitimate or not. The law that they were using was from 2000, mind you, not post 9/11. It was a 2000 law in the UK. But the thing is that people need to know their rights. So one way to protect yourself is to know. Now, of course, why is this guy going to know what the British law is regarding his rights when detained and so on? But I do encourage everybody to know. This applies across the board. It applies to if the police pick you up for something. You know, it's important to know what you are allowed, what they are allowed to do and not do.
Okay, just quickly, the two of you, Meredith, what advice would you offer to people sitting in this room about what I just described?
Quickly, I think this is a very individualized question. So if you are a human rights worker working with LGBTQ communities in Uganda where being gay is punishable by death, the answer is very different than if you are a Guardian journalist living in the UK, right? And so you do need to recognize, again, this is a relationship between the surveiller and the surveilled and what your threat from the surveiller is, which is not static.
So that's one thing already, is to think about that, right?
Think about it, yeah. It's called, in digital security, we talk about threat models. And this is how we define, we do a threat model. Who are you threatened by? Why? What capabilities do they have? What digital, tools do you use that they could exploit? You create a threat model, and then based on that model, you decide what your defenses are.
So inform yourself, yeah.
Inform yourself, but this is not an individual choice, right? We have a massive business model, and this is where this maybe gets a little uncomfortable around the democratic, non-democratic framing, that is built around the collection of personal data, that is built around creating more and more and more personal data, originally to serve ads, right? Know your customer, you need to know data about them, you gather the websites, the cookie wars of the 1990s led to the massive proliferation of cookies now, and this, more and more and more data that is now in the hands of a handful of US companies. So we need to recognize that a lot of this isn't an individual choice. I can't walk down the street in Kabul or London and choose not to be surveilled. 10 years ago, that surveillance would mean something very different than it does now, because Clearview AI, a company that does automated facial recognition that uses biometric data scraped from the open web to create composites and profiles of people, could now be linked to those cameras. Probably in London, probably not in Kabul. So I think about the Kabul system, I'm like, not so useful. There's a signal-to-noise issue that they don't have the tools to sort through, whereas I think the UK government might. So we actually have to take these questions seriously and unpack them seriously and recognize that there's a political economic dimension. There is an industry incentivized to surveil, that this industry is largely based in the US with other outposts, and that industry is imbricated significantly with different states in different capacities.
Good.
Okay.
Thomas, and then we're going to pick up some questions. We've got some coming in already from.
Maybe one
Slack.
is also the answer on Frantisek's questions here, a bit in that direction. Maybe some more technical things. You all know these pop-up messages. There's a new software update available. Would you like to install or later? And please raise your hand who is clicking later. Yeah, so if you're honest to yourself, nearly everybody needs to raise their hand. It should labeled too late. Are you willing to install it now or too late? And I tell you the reason. Whenever operating system vendor is introducing a new software update, he's only telling there's a critical vulnerability which can be exploited. They're not sharing how they can be exploited, but they're sharing how to fix it. The crime actors, at the same time, taking this piece of code, this update, they inspecting it, also using AI technology these days, and then immediately scanning the entire internet after vulnerable systems, specifically vulnerable for this kind of vulnerability. And 3 years ago, the time between the release of such an update and the first scanning activities was about a month or two. These days, the shortest ever we saw this year was 6 minutes. 6 minutes after the release of a critical vulnerability. And now ask yourself how fast you are in patching known vulnerabilities. How do you deal with that? So that's the first and most important thing in my view to reduce the attack surface. It's of course not protecting me against everything, but against the majority of things which can happen to me. The second thing here is be a bit skeptic. Don't click on anything you get in your inbox. Yeah? Can it be that you have a bank account to change the password for a bank account at a bank where you have no relation to? That can't be. So why people are clicking on that? So be more skeptic on what you're clicking, because this is also a way often used to abuse vulnerabilities and introducing malicious pieces of software on your machines. And the third thing and last thing is take care on your identity, your digital identity. So if you use a 6-character password, for instance, or for example, you're guilty by yourself. Don't make it easy to the attackers. Don't use the same password for each and every services. So we do have a threat intelligence team collecting in the darknet stolen identities. They're collecting more than 5 billion stolen identities a year. 5 billion. That's a combination out of username and password. And it might be my email address being used for Amazon, but if I use the same kind of password and same email address as the user login at Google, at whatever kind of marketplace, it can be easily abused. So we make it easier to the threat actors, I would say.
Thank you very much. And I would just reiterate what Meredith said at the very beginning. The first words out of her mouth, reject all, right? Reject all cookies. I think probably.
Also in the real world would be a good idea.
No, well, yeah, I mean, I do love cookies. But I promise to try to get some input from the audience. We've got questions online, which I can see here, and I guess you can probably see on your app too if you're looking at it. And a couple of them concern Telegram. It's been a kind of a headline topic. I know Meredith is dealing with it a lot, but can we say? Oh, wonderful, great. Those are important questions, and I might try to, if we at the end have a minute to get your input on that. But I want to see if there are any hands in the audience for our panelists. I see a gentleman here in the front, in blue, and I see the gentleman, Jacob, in the back. Let's start here. Please state your name and affiliation and address your question to...
Yes, hello, my name is Igor Brylya. I'm a Ukrainian journalist at Detector Media. I write about Russian propaganda and information, and we see these different developments regarding Telegram. We have a big discussion in Ukraine what to do, and maybe the Telegram will be forbidden for officials to use it, like have channels. And right now we see this smooth. Okay, my question. How do you see? How do you see this Telegram situation? And did you see any changes in more users in Signal?
Telegram being another messaging app.
It's actually not a messaging app, and this is the core of my my answer here. I think our dashboards are where we measure active usage, and they are generally going up. I haven't checked in the last 48 hours to see if we've seen a spike or not. But I think moving to the bigger point, there's actually a massive distinction between Signal and Telegram. Telegram is a social media app. It is an app for broadcast to millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people, and it has messaging on the side. It is not private or secure. It does not include encryption in any meaningful way. So we have to recognize Telegram as more similar to Facebook or Instagram than it is to Signal. Now, I think the Telegram case has been, I would say, unfortunate because the signal to noise ratio is really out of balance. We know very little about the basis for the charges that have been released. There's a lot that is contained there around non-cooperation.
Charges against
against Pavel Durov in relation to a particular, it looks like a particular case.
He's the head of the company, or?
He's the founder, yeah.
Yeah.
So that, I'm assuming, I guess, a baseline of knowledge here that, the founder of Telegram was arrested in France when he landed in France. This was, a judge has opened an inquiry. There is a lot of speculation. There is very little concrete evidence. We have 2 press releases from the French that detail charges, but no basis for those charges. And given French law, it's likely we won't have good information apart from leaks for months, years. And so we are, from Signal's point of view, one, we recognize that there's a vast distinction, and this may not have anything to do with privacy or messaging. But again, we're waiting for information. And the second is that they have included a handful of encryption-related charges in the press release. But those charges are very, very minor. They have to do with, it appears that they have to do with Telegram not registering the use of encryption with the proper authority, which is a tiny procedural point, and not really related to the bulk of the case as we're reading it now.
Great.
However, what they do show, and I know I'm just going to continue. You can't ask me a question and not let me answer.
There's a certain amount of detail that one can give when there's a minute left. Or not.
Pardon me. In any event, it looks like there is an attempt, at least from some who are not fans of privacy or encryption, to include encryption as kind of enhancements in this case, even though they don't seem related to the bulk of the case. So we're monitoring. We have our lawyers on it, but that's the landscape as we see it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I can add to the reputation question just a very short comment.
One sentence, and then we're going to bring in Jacob.
It's frequently used by crime actors, at least the channels, to coordinate their activities. So that tells you about the reputation.
Great.
So my question is for Meredith, which is, I had a friend who was a senior director at the NSC. We talked a couple years ago about all this. He looked at me and shuddered, told me he uses Signal and has every message deleted within 1 minute automatically. What makes you so confident that the NSA is in fact not rooting around even in your service?
What do you mean by rooting around?
I mean, why do you think that Signal is immune to the kind of surveillance or the efforts that Israel, other governments are making to penetrate these systems?
Well, it's not. That's not really my opinion. I think the reason that we are assured that Signal is secure, even from us, I can't look at your messages, I can't look at your metadata, is because we have developed very strong encryption that mathematically guarantees that. And we publish that encryption publicly, so the entire global security and privacy community looks at our implementation, looks at our code. We develop in the open, which means all of our code is on GitHub. You can go there and you can pour through it. And we have people who are almost like train spotters for new releases of Signal code, looking at it, emailing our security alias, telling us that, hey, there's an issue here, there's an issue there. We are very closely in touch with that community. So this is, the best of our knowledge as a global community is that mathematically, at the level of the technical implementation of Signal, Signal is not vulnerable to surveillance or to breaking our encryption. It has no backdoor.
Great.
Now,
Okay. We're over time. I'm sorry. This is a wonderful conversation, and I wish we could continue it. They're difficult issues, and I understand there's a much more nuanced discussion to be had about this. I hope we do get a chance to do this, maybe at GlobeSec, maybe somewhere else in the future. I want to thank all of you for coming and spending time with us today. Sorry I didn't get time to take more of your questions. And I want to please, all of you, give a warm round of applause to our three panelists here today. Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, and I have a note I'm supposed to tell you about what's coming up next. You're also, let's see, I think you're supposed to stay there. It says, oh, if I can find it. Oh. We'll now take a break. Please make sure to be in your seats at 14:40, so that's 2:40, when the next session on EU enlargement begins. Thank you.
Thank you.